Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Let's get more on one of our top stories now. The government's plan to tackle violent crime, which includes £40 million worth of funding. Now, this all follows a series of stabbings and shootings on the streets of London. A leaked Home Office report has suggested that police cuts are a factor in rising crime. In a moment, I'll speak to the Home Office Minister, Victoria Atkins, about that. But earlier here on the show, I spoke to campaigner and former gang member Jennifer Blake, and I asked her what she thought about the government's new funding.
How they've come up with a number, I do not know. You cannot put a number on price of what's been happening in our community. But with policing, numbers are not going to make that greatest of a difference.
Speak to Victoria Atkins, who is in Westminster for us this morning. Good morning to you. You heard there what Jennifer Blake had to say. She was interested to hear how you came up with a figure of £40 million. How do you put a price on the problem of violent crime?
Well, good morning. And of course, one can never put a price on a life, but we have worked out the strategy, which is an all-encompassing strategy dealing with young people, looking at preventing them from picking up a knife in the first place, intervening at an early stage, and from that the work has flowed. But there's a great deal of work that we've already been doing since 2016 to help tackle gang violence in particular, and I've been visiting over the last few months. I've been visiting gangs and charities that work with former gang members to see what they think we can do. And we've been listening to these opinions, these voices. We've been listening to the police, and this is what has resulted in with the strategy.
Yeah, we've been listening to the voices here on Sky News as well. And another thing that Jennifer Blake said, and a lot of the people that work in communities to help, people get away from gangs or violent crime, the one thing they do talk about is consistency of funding. And there have been government cuts to not just policing, but also to youth services, community services, social services, and all of those adds up. Where is the consistency? Because the government will cut 1 year, and then in 2, 3, 4 years' time, will give more funding, then there'll be cuts. There's no consistency, and that's what people are saying is the problem.
Well, local government is responsible for youth services in their local area, but we have committed through national projects like the Troubled Families
work with what
programme.
the government give them, and you have been cutting funding in all of those areas. So local authorities can only work with what you give them.
Well, we've been funding through the Troubled Families programme. We've been funding £920 million, targeting those families that need the most help. We've also got a range of funds, for example, the Trusted Relationships Fund, which we launched last month, which targets those children that are particularly vulnerable to exploitation. And I went to visit a children's home in West London where they're looking after girls who have been frankly let down and abused by pretty much every adult in their life. And we, through funding projects like that, we believe that we can have a real impact on the young people who need it most. Because the point of the strategy...
If there's £920 million worth of funding, that's just one of the figures you pulled out there, how is £40 million worth of funding going to make a difference? Because there is a spike in violent crime, not just in the capital, but up and down the country.
Well, this strategy is about...
It's not even new money, it's coming from an existing budget.
Well, it's new, I mean, it's Home Office money, but we're bringing, the strategy is about drawing together all of the players in government, so not just the police and the Home Office, but healthcare, education, and local government, police and crime commissioners, so that we are working together to tackle this very serious problem. We know, for example, that there's been a rise in drugs, and so we need to have an emphasis, as we did in the drug strategy last year, of recovery from drug habits. But we also want to, we see it as absolutely vital tackling county line gangs in particular, because we believe that that's the source of much of the problem.
OK, well, it's all joined up. There are various different factors at play here in what can get a handle on this problem. Is one of them police numbers? There is this leaked Home Office report that said, actually, police numbers have played a part in what's going on here. It's not the sole factor. Labour says this blows apart your position that police cuts have had no effect.
We have to be led by the evidence, and we know that in the most recent spikes in knife crime in 2008 and in the early 2000s, there were many more police on the street. And this is the point I keep coming back to. Frankly, by the time we've got the police involved, it's too late. We need to be getting to these young people before they think, before they make that terrible decision to pick up a knife.
They can be on the streets in greater numbers to act as a deterrent. They can also be in communities, playing a part of that community, and that can be a deterrent as well.
And that's why we've protected police funding since 2015, and this year we have spoken to every police force in the country to see what they need, and with the help of police and crime commissioners we are injecting a further £450 million into policing across the country. So we don't pretend for a moment that police numbers are just the only factor. There are so many factors in this, as indeed the Metropolitan Commissioner herself has said. It's incredibly complex, and we need to look at all these factors, not just focus on one or two.
Well, as you said, you have been speaking to the head of police forces. The head of the Metropolitan Police, Cressida Dick, thought that it was a good idea to have 300 extra police on the streets of London over the weekend because of this rise in violent crime. So if you're saying police numbers aren't an issue, how do you know better than the head of the Met Police, who says that you do need extra numbers on the street?
I'm not claiming I know better than Cressida Dick for one moment. What I support,
but she's
I
saying
absolutely
there needs to be
support.
more police numbers. The government is saying you don't.
That is an operational decision which I absolutely support the Commissioner in making. You know, she knows better than, frankly, bureaucrats in Whitehall how many officers she needs on the beat this weekend. And that's why we, the system of police and crime commissioners, local people working with their local chief constables, responding to the policing priorities of their local area.
It's made matters worse for those other local police forces, because these aren't 300 new police officers. These are 300 police officers that have been called off annual leave, rest days, and from other parts of the country as well, which sort of defeats the object, because London isn't the worst place in the country for violent crime. Other cities have far worse records, and that's where those police officers are being taken from. Well,
again, this is a matter for the Metropolitan Commissioner and for the Mayor of London, who is the Police and Crime Commissioner in London. They are responsible for prioritising policing needs in London. The Commissioner must make operational decisions, and she must do so knowing that, she's free to do so, and she has the operational independence. That's absolutely right.
Okay,
so what we've done is
with what the government are giving
funding.
the police force, are you confident that we are at a safe level of policing? You're not going to increase the number of police officers anytime soon?
The decision about police numbers is a matter for chief constables and police and crime commissioners, including the Mayor of London.
But you fund the
funding
police. If they're saying they need more police, then you should be giving them more police.
I'm not sure that's what the Commissioner actually said. If reading her interviews over the weekend, she said that the rise in serious violence isn't. She didn't claim that it was resources or number.
And they need more resources.
And they're getting them because we've protected police funding since 2015, and what is more, we're injecting a further £450 million into policing across the country. But of course, also the Met has reserves of, I think, £240 million, and so this is about policing priorities. I'm delighted that the Mayor of London and the Commissioner are giving this their full attention, and the Commissioner has made decisions for this weekend. But this must be dealt with at local level. It's not, frankly, for bureaucrats in Whitehall to dictate to chief constables how many officers they should be deploying and where they should be deploying them. It must be targeted according to local need.
OK, Victoria Atkins, Home Office Minister, thank you for speaking to us here on Sunrise this morning. Thank you.
This morning, the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, is going to outline government plans to tackle violent crime following a series of fatal stabbings and shootings on the streets of London. This comes as a leaked Home Office report today suggests that police cuts are a factor in the rise of violent crime, something the Home Secretary appeared to contradict in an article yesterday. Well, I'm joined now by Dr. Simon Harding, the Associate Professor in Criminology at the University of West London and a specialist in gangs and youth violence. Welcome.
Good morning.
To you. OK, let's start with basics. There have clearly been some very horrid incidents that have grabbed the headlines in recent weeks in London. Overall, violent crime, gang crime, knife crime, firearm crime, is that going up or going down?
Well, certainly we've seen an evolution in how gangs present. It's not the first time we've had a spike in violence of this type. Londoners will remember 2007, 2008 when we had a similar spike. But this time round we have some changes. Some things have altered significantly. One of which is gangs themselves have perhaps expanded. They've got younger at one end, they've got older at the other. There are more people in them, more competition, more violence. In addition to that, we have changes in drug dealing and drug supply. People now able to get drugs through dial-a-dealer, so the drugs will be delivered directly to your home. And then we have social media. Gangs, of course, have traditionally engaged in their behaviour on local estates and neighbourhoods, but much of that activity has also now shifted online, and that itself can be a generator of violence.
And is this a particular problem in London, or is it in inner city areas throughout the UK?
Well, the gang agenda comes really from poverty. So poverty and deprivation are the drivers. So wherever you have that, whether it's Manchester, Birmingham or Glasgow or London, you will see this.
Well, you mentioned Glasgow, you see, because a lot of people are saying, well, Glasgow's got on top of this. Have they got on top of it?
Well, they had a very long-term strategy, and what they did was they engaged with the communities, they developed a public health approach, and that approach, which shifts it slightly from the crime focus, allows a range of partners to coalesce and get behind the argument in a very productive way.
And that might back up the claims which we've had from the Home Secretary that this is not all about police numbers. It's to get on top of it, it requires a much broader approach than police numbers.
It does. I mean, the policing aspect is just one element of it. We're talking, of course, about interpersonal violence, and you may find that a lot of that is going to take place regardless of whether there are visible police on the streets. But I think for any strategy or action plan to be successful, the government, the police, the partners will need to engage with the local communities.
So, Home Secretary going to announce this plan, I think, at 11:30. We have had leaks in advance. What do you make of what the government's saying? Well,
I think they're heading in the right direction. They are going to be bringing forward a strategy of action in terms of reducing the availability of certain offensive weapons, zombie knives, for example. Acid attacks will be reduced, we hope, by making sure that acid is no longer available to people carrying that in public. So I think there are positive moves that are being taken.
And is it right, do you think, in view of what you were saying earlier on, to focus really on teenagers in this area? I mean, that's where the problem is right now.
Well, I think so. We know, of course, that the current spike in violence is wider than just gang-involved violence. But one of the issues, I think, Adam, is social media. Gangs can brag and posture on social media, they can present videos, and this draws a wider group of people into the orbit and the spectrum.
So the social media companies need to clamp down on this?
I think there is something for them to do, yes.
Which would involve, obviously, breaching the privacy of those people?
Well, I think all of that has to be looked at, and I understand aspects of that are going to be part of the government strategy.
Dr. Simon Harding, thank you very much indeed.
The Home Secretary is about to outline the government's strategy for tackling violent crime. In a speech in the next half hour, Amber Rudd will announce £40 million in funding to focus on prevention and early intervention. Ministers have denied police cuts have contributed to a recent spate of violent attacks, but a leaked Home Office report suggests otherwise. West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner David Jameson joins us from Birmingham. Many thanks for joining us this morning, Mr Jameson. How have you been fighting violent crime in the West Midlands?
Well, we have had cuts of £145 million per year. We've lost 2,000 police officers and 1,000 officers in the last 7 or 8 years. Now, this has got to have an impact on the quality of policing that we can now provide. What has happened especially is a lot of preventative work that we've been doing has actually come to a standstill because of the reduction in number of officers. So what the Home Secretary is saying is that we need to do more preventative work. We are trying to do that with far fewer officers than we had before. The other thing is they say they're putting £40 million into this. This is not new money. This is money they're taking away from the police forces and then putting it back into the selected areas where they want to place it.
The Home Secretary has questioned whether there is a correlation between the number of police officers on the street and the spike in violent crime, because what she says is that if you look back at the early noughties, violent crime was at high levels, yet there were more police officers being recruited.
Well, you know, these days there are far more crimes, far more complicated crimes that the police are dealing with. What they're saying is truly nonsense. And what has come out in the last 24 hours, of course, is that the Home Office own officials are now saying that that is nonsense. They're saying there's a clear correlation between reduction in police numbers and the growth of violence. So I think if the Home Secretary in the next half hour or so makes a speech where she carries on with that line in contravention to what her own officials are telling us, then she really needs to consider her position.
What steps have you been taking in the West Midlands to fight violent crime?
Well, I set up, about 2.5 years ago, I set up a Gangs and Violence Commission in an area not far from where I'm standing today. We had a big outbreak of gang violence, and we brought together people from the community, academics, many other people, and we put together a report, and we're now taking some action, particularly on diversionary work with young people. I've presented that to the Home Secretary and to ministers, and they've actually found favour in that. They've said it's a good report. What they need to do, instead of talking about this now, they need to look at the report that I made and another report that sits alongside it on drug policy, because much of this violence is around drugs. They need to be looking at the work that we've done, build on that, give us some extra resources. I did ask her recently for £2 million extra to help us with some of this work, and I've had no response. So what we're getting is fine words from the government, but not actually action that's taking place, not actually putting the resource in. So people like myself, working with my Chief Constable, can provide that sort of security and safety to our communities.
One strategy that seems to have been endorsed by many, Cressida Dick, for example, welcomed it, was an increase in stop and search powers for police officers. Is that something that you agree with and something that you would welcome?
Stop and search has to be used very carefully. Stop and search can actually have a negative effect on crime. We were stopping and searching about 60,000 people, young people mainly, 4 years ago. Only 2,000 of those was some positive action. There was an arrest or a confiscation or something. That means 58,000 people were stopped and searched without good reason. Now, we've reduced the number of stop and searches, but actually increased the number of people who have been found with something. So more intelligent use of stop and search, absolutely essential. Scatter use of it is a disaster. So we've got to be very careful how we use it. We in the West Midlands have pioneered a much more intelligence-based approach to stop and search.
And how has that worked? Have you seen an improvement, or have you seen a reduction in levels of crime as a result of that?
We've seen in some areas a reduction in levels of crime, but we've taken away the officers who are doing a lot of stops and search unnecessarily, and this all takes time. What we've done is we've now got all those response officers have cameras with them as well that can actually take a bit of film while they're doing the stop and search. We also have neighbourhood groups. People in communities are actually questioning what we're doing, and we're putting on our website all the stop and searches that we undertake. What we're seeing is that those stop and searches are being more effective now. Instead of 2,000 people now being found with something, with the drugs or weapon or whatever, we've now increased that to 3,000. So fewer stop and searches, but more results, therefore saving money, saving police time, but also not stopping and searching lots of young people and causing really quite a lot of harm, community harm, by doing that.
Mr Jameson, in the last few minutes, the Home Secretary has been speaking. We'd just like for you to have a listen to what she's had to say.
Well, I'm delighted to be able to launch the serious violence strategy today. I commissioned it in October last year, recognising that we're seeing a growing problem in serious violence. There is a lot of research that has gone into this document. It's going to be available for people to look at. I understand that something has been leaked to someone, but I don't know quite what it is or where it is. But I'm very clear on the evidence that we've set out in the strategy today. This is a complex problem. A lot of the additional violence is being fueled by drugs, and I'm determined to get to the bottom of it.
This document is by your own officials. It has been leaked. It's in the public domain, and as you probably are aware of now, it says the cuts in police numbers are a contributory factor to the increase in serious violence. Do you accept that now? Because for a long time you've been saying the contrary.
Well, it's simply not the case to pin the increase in serious violence that we've had on anything except the very complex layered problems that we've been looking at. And it's not just me saying that. You look at Cressida Dick, the Commissioner for London, she's been saying the same. She was pushed very hard on this over the weekend, and she made the point that this is a complex crime. And what we need to do is look at the many different responses we have to have. I think it is a grave disservice to the communities and families who have been so badly affected, sometimes with terrible tragedies, to try and make political capital talking about police numbers and a tit for tat. This is a really serious violence increase that we've seen, and I'm going to address it using the evidence and making sure that we use what we know, which is about early intervention, it's about drugs, it's about giving the police the right tools, increasing legislation. This is what I want to set out today.
OK, the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, speaking there in central London. Mr Jamieson, just get your reaction to what the Home Secretary said. She was asked about this leaked report saying that the cut in police numbers have encouraged criminals. She won't be drawn on that, and she says it's a complex situation.
Well, she's also saying people are making political capital out of it. Is she saying that her officials and analysts are trying to make political capital out of this? Because that's a serious allegation to her own civil servants. Now, the civil servants and analysts have come up with this evidence that there is a connection between police numbers and violent crime. She is saying that's not the case. Now, really, if she utters this in her speech today, she really, really ought to look at herself and her own position and her ministers. Is she actually misleading the public by saying that? I can tell her from my position, having lost a quarter of the police officers here in the West Midlands, has made the job of the Chief Constable and those people who are keeping us safe in the West Midlands much more difficult. And we're seeing some of that violent crime that you've experienced in London in recent days in huge proportions. We're seeing some of that happening here as well. And the only way we can combat this is having the right number of officers, having police in place, doing the job of catching people who are carrying out these things, but also in doing that diversionary work that the Home Secretary talked about. But we need a resource for that. We can't just do it on budgets that year on year are being cut.
David Jamieson, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's take you to central London, where the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, is speaking. Let's listen in.
I got wounded. The second victim is Sadiq Adam Mohammed, and he's the third. His mother later tells a journalist that the family escaped to this country from Somalia for peace, but found only blood. The family also released a statement. Violence is a constant theme in our community, they say. We have a lot of questions and need answers. Somebody has to listen to us. And more recently, more tragic news. Devoy Stapleton, stabbed to death in Wandsworth on Easter Sunday. Tanisha Melbourne-Blake, gunned down in Tottenham. Aman Shakur, fatally shot in Walthamstow. And Israel Ogunsola, fatally stabbed in Hackney. And in each of these cases, the recurring question has been why? And as Home Secretary, I've been searching for the answer. That's why last October I commissioned a review into violent crime to explore why it is that there's been an increase in homicides, knife crime and gun crime, and what we should do about it. I knew then, just as I do now, that this is a problem which we must get a grip on. So today I'm pleased to announce that I am publishing our serious violence strategy. This marks a major shift in the approach to recent rises in knife and gun crime and is being supported by £40 million of Home Office funding. This strategy represents a real step change in the way we think about and respond to these personal tragedies which dominate the front pages of our newspapers with seeming depressing regularity. But before I tell you what the evidence shows, I want to start by addressing head-on some of the theories that have been circulating. One of the contentions is that there are not enough officers on the streets. The evidence, however, does not support this. In the early 2000s, when serious violent crimes were at their highest, police numbers were rising. In 2008, when when knife crime was far greater than the lows we saw in 2013-14, police numbers were close to the highest we'd seen in decades. And the head of the Metropolitan Police has said she does not believe the recent spike in attacks is due to cuts to police budgets either. Equally, to those who blame the recent spate of violence on changes to the provision of youth services, I say that that too is far too simplistic. And in my view, simplistic arguments are no substitute for a serious strategy. And that's what I want to spend my time talking about today. In our serious violence strategy, we explore the reasons behind serious violence. We find that there is a strong link between drugs and violent crime, and that changes to the drug market appears to be the biggest driver in the increase in violent crime. We know that since 2014, over half of all homicides involved a victim or a suspect using or dealing drugs. We know that the use of crack cocaine is rising in England and Wales, and that there's a strong link between violence and crack cocaine. We also know that county lines drug dealing has become an increasingly popular way of dealing drugs around the country. This involves gangs grooming and using children and vulnerable young people to traffic drugs using dedicated mobile phones or deal lines into new locations outside of their home areas. The wider the reach of the gang, the further their violence, drug dealing and exploitation spreads. So this is the situation we are faced with. Serious violence is on the up, and in many cases, drugs are an important contributing factor. So first off, our response to violent crime must address the misuse of drugs. Last year, we launched our new drug strategy, and we will be going further. We will focus on reducing the number of people who take drugs, and we will also increase the number of people who recover from drug dependency. We will also work towards putting a stop to the county lines gangs who are selling drugs around the country. A few weeks ago, I was talking to the Chief Constable of Norfolk Constabulary, and he made it clear what a problem this is for local police forces. In fact, 70% of police forces have reported significant increases in violent crime linked to county lines. And what we're talking about here are murders, torture, and other types of extreme violence. For example, in one reported case, a man in Liverpool had his hand severed by a machete and both legs broken in a punishment attack. That's why I'm pleased to announce that this government will provide £3.6 million to support a new National County Lines Coordination Centre, which is currently being developed by the National Police Chiefs Council and the National Crime Agency to support more effective action against these types of gangs. This will help the police catch the perpetrators and will also support measures to protect vulnerable people who have been drawn into county lines drug dealing networks. It will also provide vital intelligence about illegal drugs markets across the country, and it will support police forces to close down the mobile phone numbers used for county lines drugs dealing. In addition to this, we'll be running a nationwide campaign in partnership with the charity Crime Stoppers to raise awareness of the problem of county lines and to prevent and protect more people from being exploited and drawn into these gangs. And while I do not think we can arrest our way out of the problem of violent crime, I do believe the police have a vital role to play in tackling it. I've heard what the Metropolitan Police Commissioner Cressida Dick and others have said about officers losing confidence in using stop and search, and I must say that really worries me. Let me make my position absolutely clear. I stand fully behind stop and search, and I see it as a vital tool for the police. Of course, stop and search will always need to be used appropriately, like any other police power. But thanks to the introduction of body-worn video across police forces, I have greater confidence than ever before that this is the case. I believe that a combination of stop and search, hotspot policing strategies to focus on those areas where crime is concentrated, as well as better use of data so police forces can routinely monitor, adjust and test their response to violent crime, will make a difference. But I also want to make the police's job easier by making weapons harder to come by. I've seen what's going around our streets.
Apologies for that. We seem to have lost the Home Secretary there. She was launching her serious violence strategy, which she says will be supported by a £40 million scheme investment by the government. It will look at the best way of pushing through early prevention in order to tackle this spike of violent crime that we've seen in the capital and elsewhere in the country. She also once again spoke about this issue about police numbers and whether the drop in police numbers have contributed to the rise in violent crime. And she said that it hadn't, because if you look at the early noughties, where police numbers were at their highest they'd been for some time, you also saw an increase in violent crime figures as well. And she said also with the issue regarding social services and funding youth services for young people, she added that that argument was simply too simplistic. So the Home Secretary there launching her serious violence strategy, a £40 million investment to look at early prevention of violent crime and tackling that after the spike that we've seen in London and elsewhere in the capital. We're just going to take you live to central London, where the Home Secretary is launching her serious violence strategy. Let's have a listen in.
I'm interested in making them based on evidence. In terms of the police numbers, we have a process, and the policing minister spoke to all 43 police forces last year. I spoke to quite a few of them myself, in order to make sure that we responded to what they need. There are elements where police forces can do more to help themselves, and we all acknowledge that. There's efficiencies they can put in place, there's new equipment they can put in place. They tell me themselves that the new equipment that they have, particularly in reporting crimes on handheld devices, can save 10% of their time in a day. So we have to make sure that the police are doing the right thing to use the resources that they have. We engage with them. We got a response, we provided the extra resources. That was an evidence, fact-filled piece of research that we did at the Home Office. This is a different part of our delivery. It's about looking at what is causing this serious violence and putting a strategy together for it. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Home Secretary. Javed Khan, Chief Executive of Barnardo's. I'm pleased to welcome the strategy and the various aspects that you are covering from a quick glance. I'm also particularly pleased on the focus on early intervention and prevention and the recognition of the exploitation of children and young people through county lines, for example, and the recognition that the role that the voluntary sector can play in addressing this challenge often gets forgotten. Two specific comments, if I may. Everyone that's worked in this field over many years will say to you that this challenge demands a long-term sustained intervention. Short-term sticky plaster solutions just don't work. Your thoughts on that would be helpful to hear. And secondly, the focus on early intervention and prevention needs to include a really detailed understanding of the various risk factors that bring children and young people into either perpetrator or victimization, whether that's disrupted family life, school exclusions, early criminal convictions, early trauma experience, which goes unsupported in many cases. All of these add to the vulnerability and risks for children and young people. From a quick glance, I'm not sure how well that is addressed in this strategy.
Well, I hope you'll come back to me when you've had a longer glance and let me know where else you think we can improve it. Because I recognise that this is not just for government to do, it's not just for councils to do, it's for us all to do, and the voluntary sector plays a really important part in that. And the work that Barnardo's does is really important, and the work that you've done on the working with us on the Child Sexual Exploitation Centre of Excellence is absolutely critical as well. I acknowledge the criticism in terms of the stop-and-start nature sometimes of initiatives to address this. And that has come up with people with me before. This morning I hosted a roundtable with a number of people from community groups who made exactly that point to me. This is why it's so important that this is a cross-party initiative. This is why I'm pleased that we've got other parties working with us on this, and I'm pleased that we've got the commitment of leading members of the police, of other organisations, to make sure that it's a commitment that doesn't just start, but has a long period of engagement and support. I recognise that problem, and we will address it. Thank you.
OK, we're going to leave the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, there in central London, launching her new strategy to fight violent crime. This comes after a leaked document which appears to disagree with her assessment of police numbers and her claim that police numbers haven't directly affected the rise in violent crime. So Amber Rudd, talking in central London, she has launched a £40 million scheme, an investment from the Home Office, which will be used to tackle violent crime in London and elsewhere in the United Kingdom.
Well, recently there's been a lot of discussion about crime figures and whether police cuts are having a direct effect. Let's take a look at some of the headline figures for you now. Well, according to the Office for National Statistics, the number of police officers dropped from 142,363 in September 2010 to 121,929 in September of last year. Well, that's a drop of 20,434. Further figures from the ONS showed that in the year from March 2016 to 17, police recorded an 18% increase in violence against the person crimes. Well, this is despite an overall drop in crime across the board of 9%, according to the National Crime Survey. Well, I'm joined now by Labour MP Chukra Munna, who will be joining the Home Secretary's cross-party serious violence task force. Welcome to you. What do you hope to bring to this task force set up by the Home Secretary?
Well, I think if I played party politics and was tribal about this and refused to work with others in the public sector to reduce the bloodshed and the injuries we see on the streets in my community, then I would never be forgiven. And look, this has been going on for many months, years. I led a debate in the House of Commons in March of 2016 on this, highlighting how we were seeing more and more bloodshed on our streets. And unfortunately, it always has been relegated to the back of the queue in terms of the national conversation, which is why I'm glad that you and other broadcasters are covering this. But you should really be covering this every single time we see death on our streets.
Just on that point, why do you think it has been relegated in the national debate?
Well, you'll probably have to ask your editors, Gillian, but let me speculate. If we were looking at the stabbing and shooting of young people in some of the most prestigious schools in this country, amongst our middle-income families in this country, I think this would be front-page news every single week. The fact is, this is affecting some of the most deprived wards in the UK, including in my own constituency. And I think to some extent there is just this attitude that says, oh, well, that's to be expected in those communities. And I think that is totally and profoundly wrong. It's also one of the reasons, Gillian, that I don't really like the use of the word and the term gang when we're talking about our young people. They aren't gangsters. They are our young people. They are people that we should be caring about in our community, regardless of their background. And the problem with the use of that term, not only is it inaccurate, actually, because compared to, say, 10 years ago, you are not seeing such big groups of young people engaging in this activity. It's much more localised. It's often revolving around a particular estate. Social media has changed the whole way that this works. But it also, when you talk about our young people being gangsters, it reinforces this notion that they are gangsters when they are not. And I have to confess, look, I've been guilty in the past myself of using the term, and I don't use it anymore. Now, you talked about police numbers there, Gillian. Police numbers matter, of course they do, and you can't hope to deal with this problem without actually, I think, an increase in neighbourhood policing, police officers in communities like mine. But it's not the only solution. This is a much more complex issue. It goes far beyond the issue of police numbers, in my view.
Are you suggesting that the issue is being ignored because a lot of the people it affects are from disadvantaged backgrounds and a lot of them are black?
I think there's definitely some truth in that. My friend and colleague David Lammy, who's the Member of Parliament for Tottenham, whose community has been impacted in much the same way as mine, has made that point, and I think he makes it well. But look, what I'm hoping the task force will do is enable me and others on it to actually scrutinise government delivery of this serious violence strategy that they've announced today and hold their feet to the fire, because there's a whole range of things that we need to see happen here. Out of school, we've got to have better youth provision, in my view, and we've got to elevate the role of youth workers so it's on a par with teaching. It's not some added extra you get volunteers to do, but we need to develop it further into a profession that we see like teaching. That's something out of school. We've got to make sure that that's happening and there's enough things for our young people to do. But in school, we've got to ensure that our young people are taught about the consequences of this kind of violence, and our schools need more support to do that. We also need to bring people into our schools who've both been victims and perpetrators of this, and perpetrators who've, got themselves out of this lifestyle. Get them to actually talk to young people about the consequences of their actions. They're far more likely to listen to somebody from that background who's actually been involved in that kind of culture of violence than, say, a teacher or somebody like me coming into a school. But I think one way in which things have changed, and this is, as I said, been going on for a number of years, is whereas I think 10 years ago, the youth sector, and I worked in it myself, I was a trustee of a number of youth charities before I was elected. I think back 10 years ago, this was still primarily seen as an issue revolving around sanction, enforcement, and policing. But actually, I think increasingly we need to do what the World Health Organization has urged different parts of the world which are dealing with these kinds of problems to do, which is to look at this as a public health issue. And that was actually the approach that they adopted in Scotland, in Glasgow, where they managed over a decade to reduce violent crime, cut it in half. So there's a whole number of things that we have to do. And the final thing I would just say about this, look, this is a government strategy. And you've got what government's doing nationally, but also my local authority actually in Lambeth is adopting that kind of public health approach. But in the end, this isn't just an issue for government, national or local. It's an issue for every single one of us, because these are our young people we are talking about. It is their lives being lost on our streets. And we've all got to take ownership of this problem and solve it, because we cannot have this happening in Britain in 2018. We simply can't carry on like this.
Absolutely, and there are lots of issues to go at, as you suggested there, but they are long-term. In the short term, the police have been analysing what they can do to improve the situation with the level of violence on the streets. And one of the things that they were saying over the weekend, that officers were saying, is they shouldn't be frightened to employ the use of stop and search. Is that something that you would agree with?
Well, there's two things I'd say about why is this happening now. And I think the point that the Home Secretary made today about the connection between this kind of violence and the illegal drug market is definitely well made. And county lines, people may have heard talked about, where young people from communities like mine are used to move around drugs around the country, sell cocaine in other parts of Britain, is definitely an issue. Secondly, stop and search has its place. I don't think anybody in my community would say that it shouldn't be used, but it's got to be used in a sensitive way. It's got to be intelligence-led, and it shouldn't be done in a way that humiliates our young people. And unfortunately, too often that happens. And actually, in my borough, I think the borough of Lambeth, we have the highest rate of stop and search in the country. And one of the things actually that has made a big difference, and I and a number of other people in our community, including my local council, campaigned for this. What's made a big difference actually is having police wearing body-worn cameras. One of the reasons the main reason I wanted body-worn cameras carried by police is so that when these stop and searches are done, they're properly recorded. And what the early statistics and data show, because they've only recently been rolled out across London, is that where police have these body-worn cameras, there are far less complaints about the way stop and search is done. So I think that is one positive, and to the extent that other police forces around the country are not using body-worn cameras, if they do too, I reckon we can get to a better place in terms of the way stop and search is deployed. So it's got its place, but it should not be used to humiliate young people, and we should not see stereotyping of our young people and the abuse of this power by the police.
So it has its place as long as it's intelligence-led. Chukwumuna, thank you very much for speaking to us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Gangs that recruit children as drugs couriers will be one of the targets of a new government strategy aimed at cutting violent crime in England and Wales. The Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, has announced a series of measures, including messages online and more support for organisations helping young people. A leaked Home Office report linked a rise in violence with falling numbers of police officers. Here's our Home Editor, Mark Easton.
Behind the statistics and the politics of violent crime is the desperate agony of heartbroken families, like the family of Dami Odiyingbo, who died after being stabbed in London in January, one of more than 55 killings in the capital this year. He was just 18.
I was helpless. I couldn't do anything to help him. You know, I wish I could do something, but there was just nothing I could do. I was just, you know.
As Home Secretary Amber Rudd knows, the public wants answers. Why are the killings apparently rising, and what will she do about it? Her answer, a new strategy, promising a major shift in the government's approach.
This strategy represents a real step change in the way we think about and respond to these personal tragedies which dominate the front pages of our newspapers with seeming depressing regularity. A crucial part of our approach will be focusing on and investing more in prevention and early intervention.
A major shift in strategy to end violence on our city's streets, the Home Secretary says in this report today. But back in 2011, her predecessor at the Home Office, Theresa May, also launched a government report promising to end gang and youth violence. And in 2016, another government report also promising an end to gang violence. Critics point out that some of the initiatives in these documents have already been cut or abandoned.
Labour MP Chuka Umunna, who's been asked by the Home Secretary to join a cross-party task force on violence, says it's vital to take the politics out of the issue.
There isn't one solution to the problem here, it's multifaceted, and that's why you've got to put the politics to one side, you've got to bring all parts of the public sector together with the third sector to stop this bloodshed on our streets.
So we kind of took the approach where we came on a weekly basis to build relationships with the key young people.
There's money for early intervention schemes and to divert young people away from drugs. There's no extra cash for more police officers, even though a leaked government document suggests pressure on police resources may contribute to rises in gang violence. But is it that simple? Looking at the last 10 years, police numbers have fallen by around 20,000 in England and Wales, but crimes of violence resulting in injury have also fallen over the decade. In fact, the best measure of crime trends suggests serious violence has more than halved. That's not how it feels to some, though. There are signs knife crime may be rising in some areas, and after 13 consecutive years of falls, the murder rate has started to increase again.
I got to the hospital, my boy was already dead. So I didn't get to speak to him. That broke me. Saw my son on the bed, dead. It broke me totally. All I was just doing was crying all day. Dami is a beautiful soul.
There are no easy explanations for what leads one young person to kill another, but making our towns and cities safer is a job for more than just the police and more than just the short term. Mark Easton, BBC News.
We start tonight with a frontline account of the rising tide of violence facing overstretched police forces up and down the country. ITV News filmed with officers in Birmingham ahead of today's plans unveiled by the Home Secretary to make Britain's streets safe. They told us they need more resources to deal with the growing epidemic of gun and knife crime. We also heard from young people who say they carry weapons because they fear for their lives, not the law. More from them in a moment. First, our national editor, Allegra Stratton, on the thinning blue line.
Birmingham, Saturday night.
Shootings are daily business now.
Stabbings?
A daily business. Violent crime feels like it's on the up. Knife crime is almost certainly on the up.
Inspector Matt Minton, behind the wheel, is in charge of all police patrols here. He's protecting 1.5 million people.
So this is a report of 10 to 15 people with weapons breaking into the premises.
Matt's team is first on the scene at this warehouse.
Hands out! Hands out!
Inside, they disturb a gang of armed men mid-burglary.
Drop this guy for me, please.
This is just the start of the crime scene.
They've been doing a burglary, they're picking up some electrical equipment. We've got some bags of cannabis on the floor down here. Caught one of them going through the window there. There's a knife down on the stairway down there, a couple of fairly hefty crowbars.
5 arrests were made here. It's a fraction of the total across Birmingham tonight. They were found with marijuana and at least £2,000 cash on them.
Some of these guys have got firearms markers, so not a great group of people.
They came at you with the crowbars, didn't they?
Yeah, they had a bit of a swing at me as I was coming through the window.
In the pitch black?
Yes. Not unusual, no.
These arrests are a good result for Matt's team, especially on a night when he has had to deploy 7 fewer officers onto the street than the level deemed safe.
It's not ideal that this is one of our busiest evenings. It's going to be our busiest time. Ideally, we would have more people on at this point. We can manage with less, but obviously we get to less jobs, which means that we service less calls, which means that we don't help as many people as perhaps we would like to be helping. The numbers go down, but the geography that we cover goes up. I guess the difficulty is at what point do we say enough's enough, and actually it drifts from being effective to ineffective and not particularly safe.
Have you reached that point yet?
I really don't know. Is the I wouldn't want to test it much further. Let's put it like that. I wouldn't want to go to any lower numbers.
Another call out. Men on the loose with a machete.
Victor 1, 2 on foot, Churchill towards Handsworth Park. Someone's broken in and they're threatening the occupants with machetes, trying to take the car keys off them. Now we suspect...
The dog's out now.
Yeah, we suspect they're in the gardens somewhere around here.
Matt leaves the firearms team to search. He gets back to patrolling streets he finds more violent than ever before.
It feels like it's more violent than when we first started out, because it used to feel that we had a lot more numbers of officers, so the amount of jobs that you went to was watered down somewhat by the number of people that were going to the jobs.
What's driving it?
If the sceptic in me would say that there's a far less likely chance of them getting caught at the moment.
So they're just trying it on?
There's no huge deterrent there.
Back at the station, Matt's finished his 8-hour shift, but the funding issue isn't going anywhere.
There was definitely some slack. There was definitely some work to give up. It feels that perhaps we've gone a little bit far now.
Too many police officers not on the beat anymore.
Yes, yeah. It would be nice to have more. We find that every day we're trying to find resources to send out to jobs that we'd consider emergency jobs, and we're scratching around a little bit to do that. So I think if we could avoid that, then we'll be about the right level.
It's now certain in Birmingham and all UK cities there is an increase in violence. The problem is it's alongside a decrease in the ability of Matt and his colleagues to deal with it. Allegra Stratton, ITV News, Birmingham.
ITV News has also been given a glimpse into the reality of life for some teenagers on Birmingham streets. One 15-year-old boy showed us a machete he says he carries for protection. His teenage friends said they are scared, but they are also prepared to kill. Martin Geisler reports on the cycle of violence.
It's not hard on the streets of Birmingham to find evidence of Britain's problem with violent crime. The first group of teenagers we approached were happy to talk to us about gangs and weapons. It's a culture they're immersed in, they told me, and they can't escape.
Everyone has to be ready whenever. Like, it can happen anytime. If they come around the corner now, that's it, it's ready.
Do you carry a knife?
Sometimes. Self-defense. If I don't have nothing on me, they have something on them. They're going to get me. I'd rather get them than them getting me.
As we spoke, he pulled this from his tracksuit trousers.
Just tell me why you've got that.
It's because if somebody backs out a knife to me, I'm going to have something bigger to scare them, so I'm not scared.
But you're prepared to use it? It's not just for show?
It's not just for show. I'm prepared to use it if someone's willing to take my life. I'm willing to take theirs first.
You would kill somebody with that, right?
If it's going to protect my life, then yeah.
And that would change the rest of your life. You go to jail, that would be it?
If I get caught. But yeah, though, as long as I'm still alive.
They're scared, they told me, frightened of the streets they're growing up in. We've had to obscure their faces and their voices because they're just 15 years old. But there's no disguising the depth of the problem here.
If it's a violation to one of my boys, or a violation to us, then obviously, what are you going to do? You're going to stand there and take it? Are you going to react to it?
Do you carry a knife?
Not all the times.
But sometimes?
Yeah.
And would you use it?
If I have to, innit?
If anyone had a reason to call for tougher punishments for carrying knives, it would be Alison Cope. Her son, a successful young music star, was stabbed to death almost 5 years ago.
This is Josh's bedroom. I've just had it redecorated the same as it was.
Now she takes his ashes to schools, lecturing children on the dangers of gang life. 4 schools a day, 5 days a week. Early intervention is every bit as vital as tough policing, she says.
There's not one answer. It's a combination of quite a few things, and each one of these things costs money. But if the government invests at the beginning of the problem, they will save millions towards the end of the problem. And I don't understand why they can't work that out themselves.
Birmingham has a thriving new music scene. It's been blamed for the rise in violence here. The artists stand accused of feeding the problem, glamorising it. Crime and weapons feature heavily in their lyrics and videos. But this rising star told us they're simply reflecting what they see. Broken homes and a broken society, where gangs often provide the only sense of belonging.
I blame the government, to be honest. Really and truthfully, I blame the government. They take everything away from us, so what else have we got to do? You take our youth centres, where we got to go? You take our home when our mother can't pay the bills. Like, what are we meant to do? If we're born in poverty, then we have to do whatever it takes to get out of poverty.
Of course, this problem runs far deeper than closed youth clubs or even police cuts. You could blame job opportunities, social media, mental health, the family unit. The people we've spoken to here believe all of that feeds into the rise in violent crime. If they're right, it's a vast challenge for any government, fixing the very fabric of modern life. Martin Geisler, ITV News, Birmingham.
Well, the Home Secretary Amber Rudd today announced the government's plans to tackle that rise in violent crime and the culture behind it. But it was all overshadowed by a row over cuts in police numbers. Our national editor Allegra Stratton joins me now. Allegra, what is this row? What's behind it?
This row is about whether there is a link between the increase in violence and the reduction of 20% in the last 7 years in police numbers. Now, the problem for the Home Secretary, who over the weekend was saying there categorically is no link, is somebody doesn't like her very much, because last night there was this leaked document, and it is, as you can see, official sensitive. It's from her department, and it says there is a link. It's clear that it's not the only link between causing the increase in violence, but it's there nonetheless. Now, the problem then is that the Home Secretary gets up this morning. She announced she launches this very interesting, very good document, except for the fact there is absolutely no mention of police numbers, police resources, police anything. It's a glaring omission. It was very, very stark, and it's a point that I put to the Home Secretary earlier today.
In terms of the police numbers, we have a process, and the policing minister spoke to all 43 police forces last year. I spoke to quite a few of them myself, in order to make sure that we responded to what they need. There are elements where police forces can do more to help themselves, and we all acknowledge that. There's efficiencies they can put in place, there's new equipment they can put in place. They tell me themselves that the new equipment that they have, particularly in reporting crimes on handheld devices, can save 10% of their time in a day.
So it's a strategy that doesn't involve more policemen, but can it work?
There is supposedly some more money coming for the police. I think we've got to go over the details of that in the coming days. I'm not sure it's quite enough. This is a pretty good strategy if you remove from it the fact that there's no mention of the police. It in particular focuses on this issue of county lines. This is young people being groomed by drug gangs and pushed to sell drugs around the country. It's thought to be a massive part of that increase in violent crime. It's something here on this programme we exposed 18 months ago. So there's a lot of excellent work that's been welcomed, but I think it is a pity that it has been overshadowed by a very, very serious debate about police numbers.
Allegra, thanks very much indeed.
The Home Secretary Amber Rudd launched the government's long-awaited serious violence strategy today and vowed to do, quote, whatever it takes to tackle the recent increase in stabbings, shootings and acid attacks. The plan will get £40 million from the Home Office budget. There'll be particular focus too on a new Offensive Weapons Act. That's aimed at making it more difficult for people to arm themselves. Shortly we'll hear from a group of young people in South London. But before that, here's Paul McNamara.
Where are the politicians, the nation asked as bodies fell in UK streets last week. Assembled today, they have a £40 million plan to tackle rising violent crime, the Home Secretary said, and an explanation as to why she believes it's increased so significantly, so quickly.
We find that there is a strong link between drugs and violent crime, and that changes to the drug market appears to be the biggest driver in the increase in violent crime.
This isn't a knee-jerk reaction to the spike in fatal stabbings on the nation's streets. The Serious Violence Strategy report was commissioned months ago. Its focus now, a new offensive weapons bill restricting the sale of knives online and the sale of acid to under 18s, and early intervention, labelling £11 million to related projects. But there was one glaring omission from today's report.
There is an impressive level of detail in this 110-page document. It analyses the effect of early intervention. It looks at the drugs trade and the impact of that on violent crime. It even looks at the international drugs trade. Yet for all this analysis, it doesn't once look at the impact of cuts to police resources. That's 21,000 fewer police officers, 7,000 fewer police community support officers since 2010.
To compound that thought, a Home Office document from February leaked today said a lack of resources and fewer people being charged had not been the main driver, but may have encouraged offenders to commit crimes.
One of the contentions is that there are not enough officers on the streets. The evidence, however, does not support this. In the early 2000s, when serious violent crimes were at their highest, police numbers were rising.
A stance Labour disagrees with.
There clearly is an impact in loss of police numbers, but there's also an impact in the closure of youth centres, in the unaffordability of a lot of sports centres, and the housing problems that many young people are going through. It has to be a wraparound sense of inclusion within our society.
Social media giants have been asked to do more to remove videos like this, gangs taunting rival gangs. And the Home Secretary has pledged £3.6 million to tackle so-called county lines, drug distribution networks where city gangs courier heroin and crack cocaine to rural or coastal towns. Labour MP Vicky Foxcroft is on the Youth Violence Commission and has a vested interest in today's report.
You know, we've had 7 young people murdered in this constituency.
7?
7 young people since I've been elected as the MP, and that's only since 2015.
Do you think Amber Rudd's on the right track then?
I think there's some warm words within the stuff in terms of a commitment towards tackling it. But what we really need to see is there the money there to go and do it? And is there the absolute commitment in terms of really delving into the root causes?
That's the long term. In the short term, the violence continues.
Paul McNamara there with the government plan. But what about the people caught up in the violent crime which is corroding some communities? Simeon Brown met up with members of Football Beyond Borders in Brixton. That's a charity that uses football to support disadvantaged young people in South London. He's been asking them what they think of the government's plan and the recent focus on social media and stop and search.
What is it kind of like to live in London right now and be a young person?
It's all right, but you have to be careful how you go about your daily life, because you don't want to get involved in what's happening with the drugs and the knife crime, because if you do, it's kind of like a downward spiral from there, because you might lose your life.
You just need to be careful, and you just need to have a strong mindset, and you just need to know where you want to go in life, because it's easy for you to get lost in this culture that's going around, what's happening around.
Today the Home Office actually made a range of proposals, and this follows the Met saying that social media is kind of exacerbating issues, and making an announcement that they want to crack down not only on social media but also kind of criminal gangs selling drugs. I mean, do you think that these proposals will be effective and make these kind of areas much safer?
I think the reason why people mainly go to gangs is because they basically have nowhere else to turn to. There's barely anything like youth clubs or places for kids to go to find a different path in life.
Do you think that cracking down on social media would help the authorities to tackle rising violence?
We didn't have social media in 2007, 2008 and 2009. There was still stabbings and gang crime going on between certain areas. We still had those issues. So this whole conversation about censoring music and censoring social media, I don't believe it will be effective.
But so again, we've seen kind of renewed calls for more stop and search to remove knives off the streets. Do you think the stop and search would make your lives safer?
it's not really helping, because you're making people that aren't involved in the crime feel wary because they are being searched when they haven't done anything wrong. And recently I was outside the chicken shop and my friends were on the other side of the road, and the police did stop and come out and search my friends and myself, but we didn't have anything on us. And for the rest of the day we felt wary because we thought we had done something wrong for them to come out of the van to search us, and we hadn't done anything wrong.
What initiatives do you want in place that are going to make areas like this much safer?
Yeah, more opportunities and more youth clubs like Football Beyond Borders, and more places for young people to feel comfortable, and more relatable people for young people to go and seek help from.
And also normalising, making young people understand that mental health is a normal thing. I think a lot of young people shy away from the fact that they're depressed. A lot of young people do get depressed. That's why it's so easy to see a young person go out on the street and stab somebody, because they deal with a lot of mental health. They've seen a lot of stuff at a young age that people should never see, and normalising the fact that mental health is something that happens to even normal everyday people.
Like, you've all spoken about the importance of investment long term, but in the short term, what short-term things can be put in place so that the streets are safe?
When the issue happened in 2007, 8 and 9, it was short-term sort of incentives that were looked at, and then look at this now, 10 years down the line, we're still back, around to square one, where the problem's still happening. So we've got to think to the future. What happens when, the 17, 18-year-olds that are involved now grow up and they have kids on their own, and then they're faced with the same cycle? We've got to break the cycle now.
Right, what is the relationship between police numbers and crime? Police numbers have been cut recently, but the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, believes that doesn't explain recent rises in crime. She announced a so-called serious violence strategy today and kept police numbers out of it. Her emphasis is on changes in the illegal drugs market. Labour, which wants to spend more on police, thinks numbers do matter in cutting crime. So we'll debate what it is that matters shortly. But first, some facts on the correlation between police numbers and violent crime, and this is for England and Wales. And first, a look at the number of police officers. And if you go back, you see that, broadly speaking, it was rising up to 2010, and then since then, numbers have been falling. So just remember that turning point, 2010. Red is the period they're rising, green is the period they were falling. Now, to measure the less serious violent crime, we tend to look at the Office for National Statistics crime survey, and that shows a pretty consistent decline in the less serious violent crime, both while the police numbers were rising and while they were falling. Now, that survey is not great for the really serious stuff that's been of concern of late. You're not going to get murder data from surveys. So we're going to look now at offences recorded by the police, gun crime, for example, and it was in a fairly consistent decline, but picked up in the last few years, lagging the decline in police numbers. And then here is knife crime. This one only goes back to 2010. That has increased too. Again, you can see the numbers rising more recently, but not the whole way through. Well, you've seen some data, so let us now ask what drives serious violent crimes. Labour Police and Crime Commissioner for Northumbria, Vera Baird, joins us from Newcastle. With me in the studio is Conservative member of the London Assembly, Sean Bailey, who in his previous life used to run youth clubs in West London. Very good evening to you both. I imagine you'll both agree that police numbers are not the main thing. Vera Baird, do you at least concede that?
They're not the main thing, but they're a very important thing.
Right. And just very briefly, Sean, do you agree that police numbers are something, even if you don't think they're the main thing?
I think that's correct, yes.
So we're sort of agreed on that. Right, how important do you think the police numbers are then, Vera Baird? I mean, they were obviously ignored in the strategy today. What do you think about the overall level?
It's completely baffling. It is completely baffling that they were utterly ignored in the strategy. 21,000 officers have gone. My force used to have 7,500 people, and it now has 5,000. We've lost a third of our people. And it's very clear that police numbers do matter. Let me say, firstly, you live every day as the person who scrutinises the way a police force works with the importance of neighbourhood policing. where people are out in the community, they are helping, they are talking to kids at school, but overwhelmingly they're collecting intelligence. And we have had some absolutely striking major trafficking and drugs arrests, which, if they hadn't been detained, and these are exactly the places where violent crime is on the increase, according to Ms. Rudd's documents, these would have multiplied, they would have continued, they would have involved money laundering and so on. That's from intelligence from neighbourhood police. And another kind of crime gets stopped because the police can see something's happening here, something's happening there. Animosity is growing between two people. So it's very, very clear that having those available can stop crime, and it regularly does. But listen, her own document says that police officers being cut has stopped crime. It's called Serious Violence, Latest Evidence in the Drivers.
Well, I think in fairness it says it's not the main driver, but has likely contributed. So
it certainly does.
It doesn't make a big deal of it. It doesn't make a big deal of it. Sean Bailey, I mean, the bit that Vera Baird was stressing was the kind of the intelligence side, wasn't it? And one does wonder that that's the first thing that people like her are going to cut when they're having to face cuts, is just people being out there so they know what's going on. I mean, would you at least regard that as being very important?
I don't think it's that simple. It's about police activity, not just resources. So you talk about intelligence, how the police are gathering intelligence, who they're gathering it from. It's that activity, what do they do? There's no doubt that the police have had to reduce some of the cash flow they've had to make real innovation, but that innovation has caused them to change and force crime downwards. The situation we see now, particularly in London with our spike, we are asking the police, what are you going to do differently? Crime has changed, so the nature of the police has changed. And remember,
I mean, all the responses... These are good words, but activity requires numbers, and you just need some slack in the system so you can deploy people to...
Activity needs some change, so the nature of crime has changed, where the police put their emphasis has changed. There's no doubt at some point police numbers matter. There's no doubt there's less efficiencies to find than there were in the past, but the idea that it's a direct correlation is not correct. Your own graph showed that, and what we want to see now is how police respond to the new world that they have to operate in, more online crime, more organised crime than we've ever had.
And Vera Baird, let's talk about the other things. I mean, the stuff that went into the strategy, a great emphasis on changes in the drugs market and the way that is working. Do you buy any of that?
Not a great deal. I think that's frankly about appeasing worry that people have about crack cocaine dealing. It has gone up a little, it has not gone up enormously, and can't possibly, it's been around a long time, it can't possibly be responsible for this. There are very many things that I think we can look at in the report and say the advocacy now is, what, £11 million on early intervention to try to stop young people from getting involved into crime at all. Yes. If that had started in 2010, when undoubtedly Mr. Bailey was recommending to the then Cameron government that it should, this whole generation of young people who are currently in very serious criminal trouble, as the age of criminals gets shorter, may not have been in it because it would have been carried out. So it's a great shame that that hasn't been a long time ago. But let me say something much more strong than that.
Quite briefly, please.
There was early intervention, there were excellent youth services, and they were slashed by the Conservative government, which has removed 370 million
As someone
from
who's
there.
been a youth worker for over 25 years, youth work is not the answer, family work is the answer. And why today was very powerful, because it's the next step in preventing crime, linking up some of the new money that's being put in, 450 million extra pounds in policing, a lot of it looking at prevention.
Well, the line is you can't arrest your way out of this issue.
There's very few things you can arrest your way out of.
So it's not the police money that's needed, it's the other money, isn't it, that you should be arguing for?
We've had £920 million focused on the families at the bottom of the scale who really need the help. We've had money in this new initiative that's talking about making children more resilient so they can't be trafficked into county lines or into sex gangs. These are the things that add themselves to policing. Because the idea that you just throw a load of police on it and you end crime isn't. It's about investing in all of our services across the piece.
Thank you both very much. Sorry, we do need to leave it there.
Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me this evening, the editor of the Times Literary Supplement, Stig Abel, and the documentary maker and journalist Jenny Kleeman. Welcome back to both of you. To the inside pages of the Daily Mail we go now. And knife crime via the music industry.
Well, yes, Amber Rudd is going to say that she's going to take on music videos that glamorise gang violence because, of course, it's not our incoherent drugs laws or police numbers that are to blame for the increase in stabbings. No, it's music videos. This is a classic thing. I'm sure that music videos that glamorise carrying a weapon or make it seem like life on the streets is you know, inextricably linked with violence. I'm sure they contribute slightly to the problem. But surely the bigger issue is, with drugs being illegal, we have teenagers going out and controlling the industry. That's what they get into wars over. And also the fact that we're living in an age where people get offended by anything. And in these, you know, for teenagers who have very low impulse control, they feel that they're being insulted and they feel that they need to resort to violence when that's the case. I just feel like these focuses on these smaller issues is.
But that wasn't the only thing she focused on today, to be fair, was
No, but she did today. She did say this is about what she's going to talk about. You know, she's talking about a whole raft of things, but surely the bigger issue is to do with drugs.
Yeah, which was part of her strategy today.
Well, not to decriminalise drugs and to stop teenagers from selling them.
Which no Conservative government will do.
Although they should do. I mean, it's still very much the "ooh, look a squirrel" method of being in charge, because you know, the central problem, as her own Home Office says, there is a massive reduction in police over the last few years. That's undeniably true. We have one of the lowest amount of police officers we've had in decades. That will mean enforcement of the criminal law is being done less often by fewer people. This is no more than stating the bleeding obvious. But I think things like this, like talking about music videos, like Jenny says, it might be 1%, it might be 0.5%, it might be 0%.
But it makes it cool to be hard. That's kind of the impression.
It exists anywhere, and I just think you start, you know, are we going to blame
Does
computer...
it exist everywhere? It doesn't exist everywhere.
What, are we going to blame computer games? Are we going to blame violent movies? We've been through this moral... And what actually happens, I think, there's something of a moral panic develops. Understandably, knife crime becomes an issue. And you actually create a vicious circle, because the more you talk about knife crime, the more you valorise and glamorise it, even in condemning it, the more people in these type of lives feel they have to carry weapons, the more they feel they have to retaliate with violence. So you actually end up in a situation of it escalating and escalating and escalating. And the answer is probably to nick people more often for carrying knives.